A desperate man. Two orphaned children. Less than 24 hours to find a wife or lose them forever. When mountain man Elias Rowan walked into that saloon and announced he needed to marry by sunrise, the whole room laughed, until a widow stood up and asked him one question that changed everything. This is a story about impossible choices, unlikely families, and what happens when survival demands more than just staying alive. Stick with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The mountains didn't care about fairness. They never had. Elias Rowan had learned that lesson young, and he'd spent the better part of 40 years proving he understood it. The Wyoming Territory wasn't a place for soft men or second chances. It was rock and wind and silence that could swallow a scream before it traveled 10 feet. Up here, above the tree line where the air thinned and the cold came early, a man either learned to be hard or he didn't last long enough to regret being weak. Elias had lasted. His cabin sat tucked against the northern face of a ridge, built from lodgepole pine. He'd felled himself back when his shoulders were younger and his hands didn't ache quite so bad in the mornings. It wasn't much, one room, a stone hearth, a roof that only leaked in two places, but it was his. No neighbors within 5 miles, no voices except his own, and he rarely bothered with that. The nearest town, a collection of rough buildings called Prospect, huddled in the valley below like it was ashamed of itself. Elias went down twice a year for supplies and coffee, and even that felt like too much humanity. He preferred the company of silence. October that year came with teeth. The aspens turned gold early, then lost their leaves in a single violent windstorm that lasted 3 days. Elias watched it from his porch, smoking his pipe, counting the ways the weather could kill a man who wasn't prepared. Hypothermia. Frostbite. Starvation if the game moved down before you got your winter meat. The mountains gave you a narrow margin, and they didn't negotiate. On the 4th day after the storm, Elias saddled his mule and rode the high trail toward the eastern ridge. He wasn't hunting, too early in the day, and the wind was wrong. He was checking the trail itself, making sure the storm hadn't taken out the bridge over Kettle Creek or dropped a widowmaker across the path. It was the kind of thing he did without thinking, maintenance born from years of solitude. If he didn't take care of the trail, nobody would. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of cold that made your teeth hurt when you breathed. Frost clung to everything, turning the world silver and fragile. His mule, a gray mare named Constance, picked her way along the narrow path with the bored competence of an animal who'd done this 1,000 times. Elias let her set the pace. He'd learned long ago not to rush anything in the mountains. It was near noon when he saw the wagon. At first, he thought it was a shadow, something his eyes were playing at him because he'd been staring at bright frost for too long. But as Constance rounded the bend, it solidified into something real, a covered wagon sitting motionless in the middle of the trail, its canvas top stained dark with weather and time. Elias pulled up short. Wagons didn't come this far up. The trail was barely wide enough for a mule, let alone a full rig with wheels. Whoever had driven it here had either been desperate or stupid, and out here those two things usually ended the same way. He sat there for a long moment, weighing his options. The smart thing would be to turn around, head back to the cabin, let whatever this was sort itself out without his involvement. People brought problems, and problems were the one thing Elias had successfully avoided for the better part of a decade. But the wagon wasn't moving, and there were no horses. He nudged Constance forward, slow, his hand drifting to the rifle strapped across his saddle. The trail was silent except for the creak of leather and the soft thud of hooves on frozen ground. As he got closer, details emerged. The wagon's wheels were locked. One of them cracked along the rim. The canvas was torn in places, flapping weakly in the wind. There were no tracks leading away, no sign of anyone trying to walk out. Elias stopped 10 feet from the tailgate and dismounted. "Anyone here?" His voice sounded strange in the cold air, rough from disuse. No answer came back. He approached the wagon carefully, rifle in hand, eyes scanning for movement. The back flap was tied shut, the rope knotted tight like someone had meant to keep something in or keep something out. He reached for the knot, hesitated, then pulled it loose with 3 hard tugs. The smell hit him first. Not death. He knew that smell, thick and sweet and wrong. This was something else. Sickness, sweat, fear. He yanked the canvas open and stepped back, giving his eyes time to adjust to the darkness inside. Two shapes huddled against the far wall of the wagon bed. Children. Elias felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. The bigger one was a boy, maybe 9 or 10, wrapped in a wool blanket that was too thin for the temperature. His eyes were open, watching Elias with the kind of stillness that came from being too scared to move. Beside him, a smaller shape. A girl, probably 6 or 7, lay curled against his side, her face buried in his shoulder. Neither of them said a word. Elias lowered the rifle slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. "You hurt?" The boy's eyes tracked him but didn't blink. The girl didn't move at all. "Where's your folks?" Still nothing. Elias stepped closer, careful, and that's when he saw the rest of it. Two bodies lay at the front of the wagon bed, covered with what looked like a quilt someone had tried to arrange with respect. A man and a woman, both still. The smell made sense now. They'd been dead for at least 2 days, maybe 3. The cold had slowed things down, but not enough. "Jesus," Elias muttered, though he wasn't a praying man. He looked back at the children. The boy's hand was clutching the girl's shoulder, holding her tight like he expected someone to try and take her. His knuckles were white. Elias crouched down, making himself smaller, less threatening. "I'm not going to hurt you. You understand me?" The boy's throat worked, but no sound came out. "You been out here alone since they passed?" A small nod. Just one. Elias felt the weight of it settle over him like a wet coat. This wasn't just bad luck or poor planning. This was the kind of tragedy that happened when the frontier stopped pretending to be fair. A family heading somewhere. California, probably, or Oregon, and they'd gotten sick. Cholera, maybe. Or mountain fever. Didn't matter now. What mattered was these two had been sitting in a wagon with their dead parents for the better part of a week, and somehow they were still breathing. He should leave. Right now. Go back to the cabin, pretend he'd never seen this, let the territory sort it out the way it always did. Children were a town problem, not a mountain problem. Someone else could handle this. But even as he thought it, he knew he wasn't going to. "Can you walk?" he asked the boy. Another nod. "What about her?" The boy looked down at the girl, then back at Elias. His mouth moved, forming words that didn't quite make it to sound, and then he tried again. "She don't talk no more." His voice was thin, scraped raw from cold or crying, or both. It was the saddest sound Elias had heard in years. "All right," Elias said, though nothing about this was all right. "We're going to get you out of here. You understand? I'm going to take you somewhere warm." The boy's eyes narrowed, suspicious. "Where?" "My place. It's not far." "What about them?" The boy's gaze flicked toward the bodies at the front of the wagon. Elias hesitated. There wasn't a good answer to that question. The ground was too frozen to dig, and he didn't have tools with him anyway. The best he could do was come back later with a shovel and hope the scavengers hadn't gotten there first. "I'll take care of it," he said finally. "But right now, I need to take care of you too. That fair?" The boy studied him for a long moment, then looked down at the girl again. Whatever silent conversation passed between them, it ended with the boy giving a small, reluctant nod. "Okay." Elias stood and stepped back, giving them space to move. The boy climbed out first, stiff and shaky, his legs barely holding him. He couldn't have weighed more than 60 pounds soaking wet, and from the look of him, he hadn't eaten in days. The girl followed, moving like she was in a dream, her eyes unfocused and distant. When they were both standing on the trail, Elias got his first good look at them. The boy had dark hair that stuck up in odd angles, and a face that was too serious for his age. The girl was smaller, pale, with tangled blonde hair and a vacant expression that made Elias's chest tighten. "What's your names?" he asked. The boy swallowed. "Caleb. This is Lila." "I'm Elias. You ever ridden a mule, Caleb?" "No, sir." "Well, you're about to learn." He lifted the girl first, Lila, settling her in front of the saddle. She was light as kindling, and she didn't fight him. Didn't react at all, really. Caleb climbed up behind her, wrapping his arms around his sister to keep her steady. Elias took Constance's reins and started walking, leading them back the way he'd come. The trip down took twice as long as the trip up. The trail was narrow, and Elias had to move slow to keep the mule from spooking. Neither of the children spoke. Lila stared at nothing, and Caleb kept his chin tucked against her shoulder, his eyes locked on the path ahead like he was trying to memorize the way out. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the ridge. The temperature dropped fast once the light went, and Elias felt the urgency in his steps as he led them inside. The cabin was cold. He'd let the fire die that morning before heading out, and now the air inside was barely warmer than the air outside. He got the children settled on the floor near the hearth, wrapped in every blanket he owned, then set to building a fire with hands that felt clumsy and slow. It took longer than it should have. His mind kept catching on the image of the wagon, the still shapes under the quilt, the way Caleb had looked at him with eyes too old for his face. When the fire finally caught, the warmth spread slow but steady, filling the small space with flickering orange light. Elias put a pot of water on to boil, then rummaged through his supplies for something the kids could eat. He didn't have much: dried meat, hardtack, some beans that needed soaking, nothing soft, nothing easy. He settled on coffee and jerky, the best he could manage on short notice. When he turned back, Caleb was watching him with that same wary stillness. Lila hadn't moved. Her eyes were half closed, her breathing shallow. "She's sick?" Elias asked, nodding toward the girl. Caleb shook his head. "Just tired." "When's the last time either of you ate?" "Don't know. 2 days, maybe." Elias cursed under his breath and handed Caleb a piece of jerky. "Start with this. Slow. Your stomach's going to fight you if you go too fast." Caleb took it with both hands, like he was afraid it might disappear if he didn't hold on tight. He tore off a small piece with his teeth and chewed slowly, mechanically, his eyes never leaving Elias. "You gonna send us away?" he asked quietly. Elias paused, the question catching him off guard. "Where would I send you?" "Town." That's what the man said before, the last town. He said orphans go to the territory office and they figure it out from there. "That what you want?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He looked down at Lila, who was starting to drift toward sleep, her head resting against his shoulder. "I want her to be okay," he said finally. Elias crouched down in front of them, meeting Caleb's eyes. "Then we'll make sure she is. One step at a time. You hear me?" Caleb nodded, though the fear in his expression didn't quite fade. That night, Elias gave them the bed, the only real bed in the cabin, and he slept on the floor near the fire. It wasn't comfortable, and his back protested every time he shifted, but he didn't care. He lay there in the dark, listening to the soft sounds of their breathing, and tried not to think about what he'd just done. He'd brought them home. He didn't know the first thing about taking care of children, didn't know what they needed, what they were afraid of, how to make any of this easier. All he knew was that leaving them in that wagon hadn't been an option, and sending them down to Prospect to get shuffled through the territorial system felt worse. So here they were. 3 people in a cabin built for one, and no plan for what came next. The days that followed settled into an awkward, stumbling rhythm. Elias had lived alone for so long that having other people in his space felt like wearing a coat that didn't fit. Everything was too loud, too close, too full of need. But he pushed through it because the alternative was unthinkable. He started with the basics: food, warmth, safety. Caleb ate like he was still expecting someone to take the food away. Slow, careful bites, always watching. Lila barely touched anything. Elias had to coax her, speaking softly, offering small pieces of softened bread soaked in warm broth. Sometimes she'd take it, sometimes she wouldn't. She hadn't spoken since they'd arrived. Caleb said she used to talk all the time, used to sing even, but something had broken in her when their parents died, and now she just stared at the world like she didn't understand what it wanted from her. Elias didn't push. He'd seen men come back from the war like that, hollowed out, their minds stuck in some place the rest of them couldn't reach. Time helped, sometimes. Sometimes it didn't. At night, he'd hear Caleb whispering to her, soft words Elias couldn't quite make out. Promises. Maybe. Reassurances. The sound of it made his chest hurt in a way he didn't have words for. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The children stopped flinching when he moved too fast. Caleb started asking questions about the mountains, about the animals, about how Elias knew when a storm was coming. Lila watched everything with those big empty eyes, but once or twice Elias caught her looking at the fire with something that might have been curiosity. It wasn't much, but it was something. And then, on a cold morning in early November, someone knocked on the door. Elias froze. Nobody came up here. Nobody. He opened the door slowly, rifle in hand, and found himself staring at a man in a wool coat and a flat-brimmed hat. Behind him, 2 horses stood tied to the porch rail, their breath steaming in the cold air. The man tipped his hat. "Morning, name's Fletcher. I'm with the territorial office down in Prospect." Elias didn't lower the rifle. "What do you want?" Fletcher's eyes flicked past him, into the cabin, and Elias knew immediately what this was about. "Heard you got some children up here," Fletcher said carefully. "Orphans. Found them in a wagon a couple weeks back." "Who told you that?" "Does it matter?" Fletcher's tone was polite but firm. "Point is, the territory's got rules about these things. Can't just keep children without going through the proper channels." Elias felt his jaw tighten. "They were dying when I found them. And you did a good thing bringing them in. Nobody's saying otherwise, but now we got to figure out what happens next." "They stay here," Fletcher sighed. "It's not that simple. The court requires legal guardianship. That means paperwork. That means proving you can provide for them. And—" he hesitated, like he didn't want to say the next part. "That means being married." Elias stared at him. "What?" "Territorial law. Orphans under the age of 12 need a 2-parent household. Judge's orders. It's been that way for years." "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard," Fletcher shrugged. "Didn't write the law, just enforce it. Look, I'm not trying to make your life harder, but the judge is coming through in 2 days. If you want to keep those kids, you need to meet the requirements. And if I don't, then they go into territorial custody, probably get placed with a family down in Laramie or Cheyenne. Could take months." Elias felt something sharp and cold twist in his chest. He thought about Lila's empty eyes, about Caleb's whispered promises in the dark, about what it would do to them to get torn apart again so soon. 2 days, he said flatly. "That's right. You expect me to find a wife in 2 days. I expect you to follow the law." Fletcher's expression softened just slightly. "I know it's not fair, but it's what we got." He turned and walked back to his horse, leaving Elias standing in the doorway with the rifle still in his hand and a problem he had no idea how to solve. That night, after the children were asleep, Elias sat by the fire and tried to think. Marriage. The word felt ridiculous in his mouth. He hadn't so much as looked at a woman in years, let alone courted one, and now he was supposed to find someone willing to marry him, a stranger. A mountain hermit with nothing to offer but a cold cabin and 2 traumatized children in less than 48 hours. It was impossible. But losing Caleb and Lila felt worse. He thought about riding down to Prospect and asking around, but the idea made his skin crawl. He wasn't a man people trusted easily. He was rough, blunt, bad with words, and the women in town, what few there were, already had lives. Husbands, families. Who in their right mind would say yes? The fire cracked, sending up a spray of sparks. Elias watched them rise and fade and made his decision. The next morning, he saddled Constance and rode down to Prospect with Caleb and Lila behind him. He didn't tell them why, didn't explain. He just said they were going to town, and Caleb, smart enough to know when not to ask questions, stayed quiet. Prospect hadn't changed. It was still a collection of rough wooden buildings huddled around a single muddy street. The saloon sat at the far end, its paint peeling and its sign crooked. Elias had been inside exactly 3 times in his life, and he'd hated it every time. He tied Constance outside and told Caleb to stay with his sister. "Don't move," he said. "I'll be right back." Caleb's eyes went wide. "What are you doing?" "Something stupid." Before he could talk himself out of it, Elias pushed through the saloon doors. The room was dim and smoky, filled with the smell of whiskey and unwashed men. A dozen faces turned toward him, curious and suspicious in equal measure. Elias ignored them and walked straight to the bar. The bartender, a man named Horace with a gut that strained his vest, raised an eyebrow. "Rowan, twice in 1 year. We being honored or invaded?" "Need to ask something," Elias said. "Whiskey first?" "No." Horace shrugged. "Suit yourself." Elias turned to face the room, his hands clenched at his sides. Every eye was on him now, waiting. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "I need a wife," he said. The room erupted in laughter. It wasn't cruel exactly, more surprised, disbelieving. A few men slapped the tables, grinning. Someone in the back shouted, "You and every other fool in the territory!" Elias stood there, his face burning, and waited for the noise to die down. When it finally did, he tried again. I'm serious. Got 2 orphans who need a home. Territorial court says I need to be married or they get taken away. Judge comes tomorrow. The laughter faded into uncomfortable silence. One man near the window shook his head. That's a rough spot, Rowan. But you can't just walk in here and expect— I'm not expecting anything, Elias interrupted. I'm asking. Anyone here willing, I'll make it worth your while. You'll have a roof, food. I'll treat you fair. More silence, and then from the back of the room, a voice. Will you be kind to them? Elias turned. A woman stood near the far wall, half hidden in shadow. She stepped forward slowly, and the light from the window caught her face. She was maybe 35, maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back in a braid and eyes that looked like they'd seen more than their share of hard years. He recognized her vaguely. Mara Ellison, the widow who ran the boarding house on the edge of town. Her husband had died 2 winters back. Fever, someone had said. She'd kept to herself since. What? Elias asked. The children, Mara said, her voice steady. Will you be kind to them? The question caught him off guard. Not can you provide for them. Not what's in it for me. Just that. Elias met her eyes and answered the only way he knew how. I've been trying for 3 weeks. The room stayed quiet. Mara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded, just once. All right, she said, I'll marry you. The silence that followed Mara's answer stretched thin and tight across the saloon. Men who'd been ready to laugh moments before now shifted in their chairs, uncertain, like they'd just witnessed something they didn't quite understand. Elias stood frozen by the bar, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. She'd said yes. A woman he barely knew had just agreed to marry him based on nothing more than a single question and a single answer. Horace, the bartender, let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. Mara stepped fully into the light now, her hands clasped in front of her in a way that looked calm, but probably wasn't. She wore a simple gray dress, mended at the sleeves, and her boots were scuffed from walking the muddy streets. There was nothing fancy about her, nothing soft. She looked like what she was, a woman who'd survived the frontier by being tougher than it was. Elias found his voice, though it came out rougher than he meant. You sure about this? Are you? She countered. Fair point. He crossed the room toward her, aware of every eye tracking his movement. When he stopped a few feet away, he could see the tiredness in her face, the lines around her eyes that came from too many hard seasons and not enough sleep. But there was something else there too, a steadiness that reminded him of the mountains. Unmovable. Patient. I don't have much, he said quietly. Cabin's small. Winter's coming. It's not an easy life up there. I didn't think it would be. And the children, they're hurting. Might be a long time before they're right again, if they ever are. Mara's expression didn't change. I know what grief looks like, Mr. Rowan. I'm not afraid of it. He wanted to ask why. Why would she agree to this? To upend her entire life for 2 strangers and a man she'd probably never spoken to before today? But the question felt too big for the moment, and besides, he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Not yet. We'd need to do it tonight, he said instead. Judge comes tomorrow morning. Fletcher said the paperwork has to be filed before the hearing. Then we'll do it tonight. Someone in the back of the saloon coughed, breaking the spell. The room slowly came back to life, men returning to their drinks and their card games, though the murmur of conversation stayed low and speculative. Elias could feel their curiosity pressing against his back like a physical weight. I've got the children outside, Odds, he said. Should probably introduce you before this goes any further. Mara nodded and followed him toward the door. As they passed the bar, Horace called out, Need a witness tonight? You let me know. I'll stand for you. Elias glanced back, surprised. Horace wasn't smiling, wasn't making a joke of it. He just looked at Elias with something that might have been respect. Appreciate it, Elias said. Outside, the cold hit them like a slap. The sky had turned that particular shade of gray that promised snow before nightfall, and the wind carried the smell of it, sharp and clean and merciless. Caleb was still standing beside Constance, his arm around Lila, both of them pressed close to the mule for warmth. When Caleb saw Mara, his whole body went tense. It's all right, Elias said quickly. This is Mrs. Ellison. She's... He faltered, unsure how to explain this in a way that wouldn't scare the boy. She's going to help us. Caleb's eyes narrowed, suspicious. Help how? Mara crouched down slowly, making herself smaller, less threatening. She didn't reach for them, didn't move too fast, just settled onto her heels and looked at Caleb with the same steady patience she'd shown Elias. You must be Caleb, she said. And this is Lila? Caleb didn't answer, but his grip on his sister tightened. Mara didn't push. She just stayed there, waiting, until finally Caleb gave a small, jerky nod. I heard you've had a hard time, Mara continued, her voice soft but not pitying. I'm sorry for that. Nobody should have to go through what you did. Lila, who hadn't reacted to anything since they'd arrived in town, turned her head slightly. Not much, just enough that Elias could tell she was listening. Mr. Rowan asked me to marry him, Mara said, addressing Caleb directly. So the law will let you stay with him. With us. Do you understand? Caleb's face went through several expressions at once. Confusion, fear, something that might have been hope. You're gonna be our ma? The question hung in the cold air. Mara hesitated, and Elias saw the truth flicker across her face. She hadn't thought this through any more than he had. She'd made a choice in a moment, and now she was standing in front of two broken children trying to explain a future none of them could see clearly. I don't know what I'm going to be yet, she said finally, but I'll do my best. That's all I can promise. It was the most honest answer Elias had heard in years. Caleb looked at Elias, searching his face for some kind of confirmation. Elias nodded once, and that seemed to be enough. The boy's shoulders dropped slightly, some of the tension bleeding out of him. Okay, Caleb whispered. Mara stood and brushed the dirt off her skirt. We should get this done before the temperature drops any further. Is there a minister in town? Reverend Hayes, Elias said. Lives above the church on 2nd Street. Might not be happy about the short notice. He'll manage. They walked through Prospect together, an odd procession that drew stares from the few people still out on the street. Elias led Constance, Caleb, and Lila still mounted, while Mara walked beside him with her chin up and her hands steady. If she was nervous, she didn't show it. The church was a small wooden structure with a crooked cross nailed above the door. Elias had never been inside. He tied Constance to the post out front and helped the children down, then followed Mara up the steps. Reverend Hayes answered on the third knock. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the kind of face that looked like it smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. Mrs. Ellison, he said, surprised. Then his eyes landed on Elias. Mr. Rowan, this is unexpected. Need to get married, Elias said bluntly. Tonight, if you can manage it. Hayes blinked. I beg your pardon? It's for the children, Mara said, stepping forward. The territorial court requires it. We don't have time for a long ceremony, just the vows and the paperwork. Hayes looked between them, then down at Caleb and Lila, and understanding dawned slowly across his face. I see. Well, this is highly irregular, but... He sighed. Come in. Let me get my book. The inside of the church was barely warmer than the outside. A few candles burned at the front, casting long shadows across the empty pews. Hayes led them to the altar and retrieved a worn leather Bible from a small table, along with a ledger for recording marriages. Do you have witnesses? He asked. I'll get Horace, Elias said, and Fletcher, if he's still in town. Give me 10 minutes. He left Mara standing at the altar with the children and walked back out into the cold. The sky was darker now, the first flakes of snow starting to fall in lazy spirals. He found Horace closing up the saloon and Fletcher checking his horse outside the general store. Neither of them asked questions. They just nodded and followed him back to the church. By the time they returned, Hayes had lit more candles and arranged a small space at the front. Mara stood to one side, her hands folded, while Caleb and Lila sat in the first pew, watching everything with wide eyes. Hayes cleared his throat. Shall we begin? Elias took his place beside Mara. She was taller than he'd realized, almost eye level with him. Up close, he could see the silver starting to thread through her dark hair, the faint scar along her jawline. She smelled like soap and wood smoke. We're gathered here under unusual circumstances, Hayes began, his tone formal but kind. But the vows remain the same. Marriage is a covenant, a promise made before witnesses. It is not to be entered into lightly. Elias felt the weight of those words settle over him. This wasn't light. This was the opposite of light. This was binding himself to a stranger for the sake of two children who weren't even his, committing to a future he couldn't imagine and probably wouldn't recognize if he could. But he'd already made the choice. Back in that saloon, when Mara had asked her question and he'd answered it, the rest was just formality. Hayes turned to him. Elias Rowan, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live? I do. The words came out steady, which surprised him. Hayes turned to Mara. Mara Ellison, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live? Mara's voice was quieter, but just as firm. I do. Then by the power vested in me by the Wyoming Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. Hayes closed his book. You may, well, I suppose you may do as you see fit. There was no kiss, no embrace. Elias and Mara just stood there for a moment, looking at each other like they were both trying to figure out what happened next. Fletcher stepped forward with a folded piece of paper. You'll need this tomorrow. Certificate of marriage. Don't lose it. Elias took it carefully, tucked it inside his coat. Horace clapped him on the shoulder. Congratulations, Rowan. Didn't think I'd live to see the day. Makes two of us. They signed the ledger, Elias's handwriting cramped and uncertain, Mara's neat and practiced, and then it was done. Married, legal, binding. Hayes walked them to the door. I hope you'll find happiness together, he said, though he sounded doubtful. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, building thin white layers on the street and the rooftops. Elias helped Caleb and Lila back onto Constance, then turned to Mara. You need to get anything from the boarding house? He asked. I'll pack tonight and come up in the morning, before the judge arrives. You sure? Storm's getting worse. I'll manage. There was that word again, manage, like it was something she'd been doing her whole life. Elias wanted to say something, thank you, maybe, or I'll try to make this work, but the words felt too small, too inadequate. So instead he just nodded, climbed onto Constance behind the children, and turned the mule toward the mountain trail. The ride back was brutal. The wind picked up, driving the snow sideways, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. Elias kept one hand on the reins and the other wrapped around Caleb to keep him from sliding off. Lila was tucked between them, her head down, her small body shaking with cold. It took twice as long to reach the cabin as it should have. By the time they arrived, all three of them were half frozen and exhausted. Elias got the children inside first, then took care of Constance, rubbing her down and making sure she had enough hay to get through the night. When he finally came back in, Caleb had gotten the fire going, small but steady, and Lila was wrapped in blankets on the bed. The boy looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. Is she really coming? Caleb asked. The lady? Mrs. Ellison. And yes, tomorrow morning. What if she changes her mind? Elias hung his coat on the peg by the door and crouched down by the fire, letting the heat soak into his frozen hands. She won't. How do you know? Because she gave her word. Caleb thought about that for a moment. You trust her? Elias didn't have a good answer for that. Trust wasn't something he gave easily, and he barely knew Mara Ellison beyond her name and the fact that she'd agreed to marry him in front of a room full of strangers. But something about the way she'd looked at the children, the way she'd crouched down and spoken to Caleb without pity or pretense, it felt real, solid. I'm going to try, he said finally. That seemed to satisfy Caleb. The boy nodded and turned back to the fire, feeding it small sticks to keep it going. Elias made them a quick meal, more jerky and hardtack softened in hot water, and then got them settled for the night. He lay on the floor again, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside and wondering what the morning would bring. Mara arrived just after dawn. Elias heard the horse before he saw her, a steady clopping sound cutting through the quiet. He stepped outside and found her dismounting from a gray gelding, a single canvas bag slung over her shoulder. She wore the same dress as yesterday, covered now by a heavy wool coat that looked like it had seen better years. Morning, she said. Morning. She tied the horse next to Constance and looked up at the cabin. In the pale early light, it looked even rougher than usual, weathered wood, sagging porch, smoke curling weakly from the chimney. This is it? she asked. This is it. Mara studied it for a long moment, then nodded. All right. She picked up her bag and walked toward the door. Elias followed, feeling oddly like a guest in his own home. Inside, Caleb was awake, sitting at the small table with Lila beside him. Both of them looked up when Mara entered, their expressions guarded. Good morning, Mara said, setting her bag down gently. She looked around the cabin, taking in the single room, the narrow bed, the lack of privacy or space. If she was disappointed, she didn't show it. I brought some things, she said, unpacking the bag. A cast iron skillet, a tin of flour, a sewing kit, a few pieces of clothing, all practical. Figured we could use them. Elias watched her move around the space with surprising ease, setting things down like she'd already mapped out where they should go. She didn't ask permission, didn't wait for instruction. She just did what needed doing. Children need breakfast, she said, glancing at him. You have eggs? No. Butter? No. Salt pork? Some. She sighed. We'll make do. Within 20 minutes, she'd cooked something that actually resembled a meal. Fried salt pork, pan bread made from flour and water, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. Caleb ate slowly, still watching Mara like she might vanish if he looked away. Lila picked at her food, but ate more than Elias had seen her eat in days. Mara sat across from them, her own plate untouched. You'll need to tell me what you like, she said to Caleb. What she likes. She nodded toward Lila. I can't cook proper meals if I don't know what you'll eat, Caleb swallowed. Anything's fine, ma'am. I'm not asking to be polite. I'm asking because I need to know. The directness seemed to catch him off guard. He glanced at Lila, then back at Mara. She used to like cornbread and stew, chicken mostly. Good. I can work with that. Mara finally picked up her fork. What about you? I don't care much. Everybody cares about something, Caleb hesitated. Biscuits. With honey, if there is any. Then we'll get honey. It was such a small thing, that promise. But Caleb's face changed when she said it, softening in a way Elias hadn't seen before. They finished breakfast in silence, and then Mara started cleaning up without being asked. Elias stood awkwardly by the fire, unsure what to do with himself. He'd never had help before. Never had someone else moving through his space, touching his things, rearranging the small routines he'd built over years of solitude. It felt invasive and necessary all at once. A knock at the door broke the quiet. Sketchipum. Fletcher stood outside, his hat in his hands, snowflakes caught in his beard. Morning, Rowan, Mrs. Rowan. He nodded at Mara. Judge is waiting down at the territorial office. You ready? Elias grabbed the marriage certificate from his coat and handed it to Mara. Keep this safe. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her pocket. They rode down together this time, all four of them on 2 horses, moving slow through the snow-covered trail. The territorial office was a squat building on the edge of Prospect, barely distinguishable from the other rough structures around it. Inside, a fire burned in a potbelly stove, and a man in a black suit sat behind a scarred wooden desk. Judge Harlow was older than Elias had expected, with white hair and a face carved deep with lines. He looked up when they entered, his eyes sharp and assessing. Mr. Rowan, he said. Mrs. Rowan. And these must be the children. Elias nodded. Caleb and Lila stood close together, their hands linked. I've reviewed the case, Harlow continued, pulling a folder from the desk. Orphaned minors, parents deceased from illness, no living relatives. You found them. When? 3 weeks ago, Elias said. Late October. And you've been caring for them since? Yes. Harlow's gaze shifted to Mara. And you, Mrs. Rowan, you married Mr. Rowan yesterday evening? Yes, sir. May I see the certificate? Mara handed it over. Harlow examined it closely, checking the signatures, the date, the Reverend's seal. Finally, he set it down and folded his hands. This is highly irregular, he said, but not unlawful. The territory requires stable, 2-parent households for orphaned minors. You meet that requirement. Barely. He leaned back in his chair, studying them both. I'll be frank with you. I don't like rushed marriages. They tend to fall apart, and when they do, it's the children who suffer. But I also don't like the alternative, which is sending these two into the system where they'll get shuffled between homes until they're old enough to fend for themselves. He picked up a pen and dipped it in ink. So I'm going to grant temporary custody. 6 months. At the end of that period, I'll review the arrangement. If the marriage is stable and the children are being properly cared for, custody becomes permanent. If not, he let the sentence hang. We understand, Mara said quietly. Harlow signed the papers with quick, efficient strokes, then pushed them across the desk. Congratulations, you're now legal guardians. He looked at Caleb and Lila. You two understand what this means? You'll be living with Mr. and Mrs. Rowan. They'll be responsible for you. Caleb nodded. Lila didn't react. Good. Harlow stood, signaling the meeting was over. I'll be back in 6 months. Don't make me regret this. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the world quiet and white. Elias helped the children onto the horse, then turned to find Mara watching him. That went better than I expected, she said. Still have 6 months to prove it wasn't a mistake. Then we'd better get started. They rode back to the cabin in silence, the weight of what they'd just done settling over all of them. When they arrived, Mara dismounted and looked at the small wooden structure with new eyes. We'll need more space, she said, and better insulation before the real cold hits. The roof needs patching. I know. Can you build? Some. Then we'll figure it out. She walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at him. I meant what I said in the church. I'll do my best, but I need you to do the same. Elias met her eyes. I will. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even a promise of happiness. It was just two people agreeing to try, which was maybe the most honest foundation a marriage could have. That night, Mara took the bed with Lila while Elias and Caleb slept on the floor by the fire. It wasn't comfortable, and the cold still seeped through the walls, but something had shifted. The cabin felt less empty, less quiet. In the darkness, Elias heard Mara whisper something to Lila, soft words he couldn't make out. And for the first time since he'd found that wagon on the mountain trail, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, this impossible thing might actually work. The first real fight came 3 days later, over something so small it was almost embarrassing. Elias had gone out at dawn to check the trap line he'd set along the creek, leaving Mara inside with the children. When he returned 2 hours later, arms full of frozen rabbit and a decent-sized beaver, he found the entire cabin rearranged. His tools, carefully organized on the wall by size and function, had been moved to a shelf near the door. The bed had been shifted 6 inches to the left. His coffee pot, the one he'd used every morning for 10 years, now sat on the opposite side of the stove. He stood in the doorway, dripping melted snow onto the floorboards, and felt something tight coil in his chest. Mara was at the table, teaching Caleb how to patch a torn shirt. She looked up when he entered, saw his expression, and her hands stilled on the fabric. Something wrong? She asked. You moved everything. I organized. There's a difference. It was already organized. Mara set down the needle. Your tools were hung so high Caleb can't reach them if he needs something. The bed was blocking the heat from the stove, and the coffee pot makes more sense on the left because that's where the cups are. Every word she said was logical, practical, probably right. It didn't matter. This is my house, Elias said, his voice coming out harder than he meant. I built it. I know where things go. It's our house now, Mara replied, just as hard. And if we're going to live here together, things need to work for all of us. Not just you. Caleb looked between them, his eyes wide. Lila had gone very still, her small body tensing like she was waiting for something bad to happen. Elias saw it, the fear in their faces, and the anger drained out of him as fast as it had come. He set the rabbit and beaver down on the floor, took off his coat, and walked outside without another word. The cold hit him like the fist, but he didn't care. He needed space, air, distance from the sudden reality that his life wasn't his own anymore. He walked to the woodpile and started splitting logs, swinging the axe harder than necessary, letting the physical work burn off the frustration. The problem wasn't that Mara had moved things. The problem was that she was right, and he hated that she was right, because it meant accepting that the way he'd been living, alone, accountable to no one, was over. He didn't know how long he'd been out there when he heard footsteps crunching through the snow behind him. Mara stopped a few feet away, her arms crossed against the cold. She'd put on her coat but hadn't bothered with gloves, and her hands were already turning red. You planning to freeze to death out here or just make a point? She asked. Haven't decided yet. Well, decide fast. Caleb thinks you're leaving. Elias lowered the axe. What? He asked me if you were coming back, twice. That boy's already lost 2 parents. He doesn't need to spend the afternoon wondering if you're the third." The words hit harder than any argument could have. Elias set the axe down and turned to face her fully. "I wasn't leaving," he said. "I just needed a minute." "Then say that next time. Don't just walk out." "I'm not used to having to explain myself." "Well, get used to it." Mara's voice was sharp, but not unkind. "You wanted this. You stood in that saloon and asked for help. Now you've got it, but help comes with complications. You don't get to pick and choose which parts you like." Elias looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same frustration he was feeling reflected back. She was right, again. And he hated it, again. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, finally. "Neither do I." Mara's expression softened slightly. "But we don't have the luxury of figuring it out slow. Those kids need stability, and they need it now. So we make mistakes, we fix them, and we keep going. That's all we can do." She turned and walked back toward the cabin, her boots leaving deep prints in the snow. Elias watched her go, then picked up the wood he'd split and followed. Inside, Caleb was still at the table, the shirt forgotten in front of him. His face flooded with relief when Elias walked through the door. "You came back," the boy said, trying to sound casual and failing completely. "Of course I did." Elias set the wood down by the stove. "Just needed to split some logs. Gets cold at night." Caleb nodded, but the tension didn't fully leave his shoulders. Elias crouched down in front of him, meeting his eyes. "Listen to me. I'm not going anywhere. You understand? I said I'd take care of you, and I meant it. That doesn't change just because I get frustrated or need some air." "You promise?" The question was so small, so desperate, it made Elias's chest ache. "I promise." Caleb studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay." That night they ate rabbit stew that Mara made from the meat Elias had brought back. She was a better cook than he was, not that the bar was particularly high, and the food actually tasted like something worth eating instead of just fuel to keep moving. After dinner, Mara pulled out the sewing kit and showed Caleb how to finish patching his shirt. Elias watched from the fire, struck by how natural she was with the boy. She didn't baby him or talk down to him, she just showed him what to do, corrected him when he made a mistake, and let him figure out the rest. Lila sat beside her brother, watching the needle move through the fabric with focused attention. She still hadn't spoken, but Elias noticed she was starting to reach for things. A cup of water, a piece of bread, instead of waiting for someone to hand them to her. Small progress, but progress all the same. When the shirt was finished, Mara held it up to inspect the work. "Not bad for a first try. You've got steady hands." Caleb's face lit up in a way that transformed it completely. For just a moment, he looked like a regular kid instead of someone carrying the weight of the world. Later, after the children were asleep, Elias and Mara sat by the fire in the kind of tired silence that came from a long day. She was mending a pair of his pants. They'd torn along the seam from too much wear, and he was carving a new handle for the axe. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "About earlier." Mara didn't look up from her sewing. "Which part?" "Walking out," making Caleb worry. Apology accepted. She bit off the thread and examined her work. "But don't do it again." "I'll try." "Trying's not good enough. Those children have had enough uncertainty. They need to know we're solid, even when we're fighting." "We're going to fight a lot, aren't we?" "Probably." Mara finally looked at him, and there might have been the ghost of a smile on her face. "You're stubborn, and so am I. That's not a combination that leads to peace." "Why'd you agree to this?" The question came out before Elias could stop it. "Really? You could have said no. Could have let someone else deal with it." Mara set down the pants and stared into the fire for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than he'd heard it before. "My husband and I tried for years to have children. Never happened. After he died, I thought that was it. That part of my life was just over." She paused. "Then you walked into that saloon, and I saw those kids outside, and I thought maybe I was getting a second chance at something I'd already given up on." "That's a lot to put on 2 strangers." "I know, but it's the truth." She looked at him directly. "I'm not doing this for you, Elias. I'm doing it for them. And for me. If that's not enough, you should say so now." Elias thought about it, really thought about it, and realized it didn't matter why she was here, as long as she stayed. It's enough, he said. The days began to blur together after that, falling into a rhythm that was awkward and unfamiliar but somehow functional. Mara took over most of the cooking and mending, tasks Elias had always handled poorly. In return, he taught Caleb how to check the trap line, how to read animal tracks in the snow, how to move through the mountains without getting lost. Lila remained quiet, but she started following Mara around the cabin like a shadow, watching everything she did with those big, solemn eyes. Mara never pushed her to talk, never made a fuss about the silence. She just included her in whatever she was doing, measuring flour, folding blankets, sorting through dried herbs. One morning, about a week after the wedding, Elias woke to find Mara already up and dressed, pulling on her coat. "Where you going?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "Town. We need supplies. I'll come with you." "No need. Stay with the children. I'll be back before dark." Before he could argue, she was out the door. Elias lay there for a moment, listening to the sound of her horse moving down the trail, and realized he was worried. Not because he thought she couldn't handle herself, Mara was tougher than most men he knew, but because the thought of something happening to her now, after everything, felt unbearable. When had that happened? When had she stopped being a stranger and started being someone he actually cared about? He didn't have an answer. Caleb stirred on the floor beside him, blinking awake. "Where'd Mrs. Rowan go?" "Prospect, getting supplies." "She coming back?" "Yes." "How do you know?" "Because she said she would." Caleb seemed to accept this, though Elias could see the doubt lingering in his expression. The boy had learned not to trust promises, and Elias couldn't blame him for that. They spent the morning working on the cabin. Elias had been putting off repairs for months, but with Mara's pointed comments about the roof and the insulation, he couldn't avoid it any longer. He and Caleb climbed up with bundles of tar-soaked canvas and spent 2 cold hours patching the worst of the leaks. Lila watched from the porch, wrapped in a blanket, her breath making small clouds in the freezing air. "Hand me that hammer," Elias said to Caleb, pointing to the tool belt. The boy passed it over, then leaned back to inspect their work. "Think it'll hold?" "Through winter, at least. We'll redo the whole thing proper in spring." "You know how to build a roof?" "Know enough not to kill myself trying." Caleb grinned, a rare, genuine expression that caught Elias off guard. The kid almost looked happy. They were just climbing down when they heard the horse. Mara came into view, leading her gelding with 2 large sacks strapped to the saddle. She looked tired, but satisfied. "Got everything we needed and then some," she called out. "Horace gave me a discount on the flour, said it was a wedding gift." Elias helped her unload while Caleb and Lila crowded around, curious. Mara had brought cornmeal, molasses, dried apples, coffee, and tucked at the bottom of one sack, a small jar of honey. Caleb's eyes went wide when he saw it. "You remembered," he said softly. "Told you I would." Mara handed him the jar. "We'll make biscuits tomorrow morning." That night, Caleb smiled more than Elias had seen in all the weeks since finding him. The boy sat at the table, carefully holding the jar of honey like it was made of glass, and for the first time he looked like he actually believed this might last. But the mountains had a way of reminding you not to get comfortable. The storm hit 2 days later, rolling in fast from the north with the kind of violence that turned the world white and erased all sense of direction. Elias had seen it coming, the pressure drop, the strange stillness in the air. But even with warning, there wasn't much you could do except board up and wait it out. The wind howled like something alive, battering the cabin walls and driving snow through every crack and gap. Inside, they huddled close to the fire, burning through wood faster than Elias liked, but not having much choice. The temperature inside the cabin dropped until their breath fogged, and even wrapped in every blanket they owned, the cold was inescapable. Lila started shivering violently around midnight. Mara pulled her close, wrapping her in her own coat, but the girl's lips were turning blue. "She's too cold," Mara said, her voice tight with worry. Elias stoked the fire higher, but it wasn't enough. The wind kept sucking the heat right out of the room. "Bring her here," he said, shifting to make space near the hearth. Mara carried Lila over and they arranged themselves in a tight circle, Elias on one side, Mara on the other, with both children wedged between them. It was crowded and uncomfortable, but the shared warmth helped. Slowly, Lila's shivering eased. "This is bad," Mara said quietly, so the children wouldn't hear the fear in her voice. "I've seen worse." "That's supposed to make me feel better?" "No, just true." The storm lasted 3 days. 72 hours of wind and snow and cold that seeped into your bones and stayed there. They rationed the firewood as best they could, but by the second night, Elias was seriously worried they'd run out before the weather broke. He tried going out once to get more from the woodpile, but the wind was so strong it knocked him off his feet, and Mara had to pull him back inside before he got lost 10 feet from the door. On the third night, when the fire was down to embers and they were all huddled together for warmth, Lila spoke. It was so quiet, Elias almost missed it. "Cold," she whispered. Mara went very still. Caleb's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Mara asked gently. Lila's voice was barely audible. "I'm cold." "I know, baby. I know." Mara pulled her closer, tears streaming down her face. "We're going to keep you warm, I promise." It wasn't much. One word, barely a whisper. But it was the first sound Lila had made since the wagon, and it broke something open in all of them. Caleb started crying, silent tears that he tried to hide by turning his face away. Mara held both children, her shoulders shaking, and Elias just sat there, feeling something raw and painful expand in his chest, something that might have been hope or fear or both. When the storm finally passed, it left the world transformed. Snow had piled up in drifts taller than a man, and the trees sagged under the weight of ice. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, the kind that hurt to look at. Elias dug them out slowly, carving a path to the woodpile and the lean-to where the animals were sheltered. Constance and Mara's gelding had made it through, cold and hungry, but alive. He fed them, checked for frostbite, then started the long process of clearing the trail down to town. It took 2 full days of backbreaking work before the path was passable again. When he finally came inside, exhausted and frozen, he found the cabin transformed. Mara had cleaned everything, organized the supplies they had left, and somehow managed to cook a real meal: fried salt pork, cornbread, and stewed apples with cinnamon. The children were sitting at the table, bowls in front of them, and for the first time since Elias had found them, they looked like they belonged there. "Sit," Mara said, not looking up from the stove. "You look half dead." He sat. She put a plate in front of him, poured coffee, then took her own seat. For a moment, nobody spoke. They just ate, the warmth of the food spreading through them like a promise that winter wouldn't last forever. After dinner, Caleb helped Mara clean up while Elias added more wood to the fire. Lila sat on the bed, watching them all with an expression that was almost peaceful. "Mr. Rowan?" Caleb said suddenly. "Yeah? You think the judge will really come back in 6 months?" Elias considered lying, softening it, but decided the boy deserved the truth. "Yeah, he will. What if he decides we can't stay? Then we'll deal with it, but that's not going to happen." "How do you know?" Elias looked at Mara, who was watching him with those steady, patient eyes, and then at Lila, curled up on the bed like she finally felt safe enough to rest. "Because we're making this work," he said. "All of us. And that's what the judge needs to see." Caleb seemed to think about that, then nodded. "Okay." Later, after the children were asleep, Elias and Mara sat by the fire again. The cabin was quiet except for the crackle of burning wood and the soft sound of breathing from the bed. "She talked," Mara said softly. "I almost can't believe it." "You did that. The honey, the patience, all of it. We did that." Mara looked at him. "Don't sell yourself short. You're better at this than you think." Elias wasn't sure he believed that, but he appreciated her saying it anyway. 6 months feels like a long time," he said. "It'll go faster than you think." "What happens after, when the judge comes back and makes it permanent?" Mara was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. I guess we keep doing what we're doing, try to give them something normal." "Normal?" Elias almost laughed. "Nothing about this is normal. Maybe that's okay. Maybe normal's overrated." He looked at her. This woman who'd agreed to marry a stranger, who'd left her whole life behind to live in a freezing cabin with 2 broken children and a man who barely knew how to talk to people. And he realized she was right. Normal didn't matter. What mattered was this: the 4 of them, figuring it out one cold day at a time. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For showing up, for staying." Mara smiled, just a little. "Where else would I go?" It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even particularly romantic. But it was real, and in that moment, it was enough. Winter tightened its grip on the mountains as December arrived, bringing with it the kind of cold that made your lungs burn with every breath. The snow didn't let up. It just kept coming, piling higher and deeper, until the world outside the cabin became a monochrome blur of white and gray. But inside, something was shifting. It started small. Lila began speaking more, though never in full sentences. Just words here and there, soft and hesitant, like she was testing whether her voice still worked. Yes, when offered food. Cold, when she needed another blanket. Thank you, when Mara braided her hair in the mornings. Caleb noticed before anyone else. Elias caught him one afternoon, sitting beside his sister, whispering encouragement too quiet to make out. When the boy realized he was being watched, he straightened up quickly, his face flushing. Just talking to her, Caleb said defensively. I can see that. Keep doing it. The boy's expression softened with relief, and he turned back to Lila, continuing whatever private conversation they'd been having. Mara saw it too, though she never made a fuss about it. She just adjusted, asking Lila simple questions that could be answered with one or two words, giving the girl space to find her voice at her own pace. It was the kind of patience Elias didn't have naturally, but watching Mara work, he started to learn. One morning, while Elias was outside chopping wood and Caleb was feeding the animals, Mara was teaching Lila how to knead dough for bread. The girl's small hands worked the flour-dusted mass slowly, carefully, mimicking Mara's movements. You're getting good at this, Mara said. Another few weeks and you'll be better than me. Lila looked up at her, and for the first time since the wagon, something like a smile ghosted across her face. It was brief, gone almost as soon as it appeared, but Mara saw it, and her hand stilled on her own portion of dough. There you are, she whispered. I was wondering when I'd see you smile. Lila didn't respond, but she didn't look away either, and that felt like progress. When Elias came back inside, his arms loaded with firewood, he found them working side by side in comfortable silence. Mara glanced up at him, and the look on her face, pride mixed with something deeper, something almost maternal, hit him harder than he expected. This was what a family looked like. Not perfect, not easy, but real. He set the wood down by the stove and brushed the snow from his coat. Need any help? We've got it, Mara said, but you can set the table if you want to be useful. Elias did, and when Caleb came back in from the lean-to, they all sat down to eat the bread warm from the oven, slathered with butter and honey. It was a simple meal, nothing fancy, but it tasted better than anything Elias could remember. Later that week, the first real test came. Caleb had been doing well, eating more, talking more, even laughing occasionally at something Elias said. But one night, after they'd all gone to bed, Elias woke to the sound of muffled crying. He sat up slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The fire had burned down to coals, casting just enough light to see Caleb curled up on the floor, his shoulders shaking. Elias moved carefully, not wanting to startle him. Caleb? The boy tried to muffle the sound, pressing his face into the blanket, but he couldn't stop. Elias crouched down beside him. What's wrong? Nothing, Caleb choked out. I'm fine. You're not fine. Talk to me. For a long moment, the boy didn't respond. Then, in a voice so broken it was barely recognizable, he said, I miss them. The words hung in the cold air, raw and honest. Your parents, Elias said quietly. Caleb nodded, still not looking at him. I know they're gone. I know they're not coming back, but sometimes I forget, and then I remember, and it feels like it just happened all over again. Elias had no idea what to say. He'd never been good with emotions, never knew how to comfort someone when words felt useless. But Caleb needed something, so he did the only thing he could think of. He sat down on the floor beside the boy and just stayed there. I'm sorry, Elias said finally. I can't fix that. Wish I could, but I can't. I know. But you're not alone in it, you understand? Whatever you're feeling, you don't have to carry it by yourself. Caleb wiped his face with the back of his hand. Do you miss anyone? The question caught Elias off guard. He thought about it, really thought about it, and realized he did. His parents, dead for 30 years now. A brother he'd lost to scarlet fever when they were both children. Friends from the war who never made it home. Yeah, he admitted. I do. Does it get easier? Elias wanted to lie, to tell the boy that time healed everything and the pain would fade. But Caleb deserved the truth. It gets different, he said. You learn to live with it. Some days are harder than others, but it doesn't have to stop you from being happy again. Your folks wouldn't want that. Caleb was quiet for a long time, considering this. Then he said very softly, "Do you think they'd be okay with us staying here? With you and Mrs. Rowan?" "I think they'd be grateful you found somewhere safe." The boy nodded, and some of the tension seemed to leave his body. He lay back down, pulling the blanket up to his chin, and after a few minutes his breathing evened out into sleep. Elias stayed where he was for a while longer, watching the boy's chest rise and fall, and felt the weight of responsibility settle over him like a second skin. This wasn't temporary anymore. This was permanent, whether the judge made it official or not. He was responsible for these children now, for their safety, their happiness, their grief, and that scared him more than any Wyoming winter ever could. When he finally stood and turned back toward his own bedroll, he found Mara watching him from the bed. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes told him she'd heard the whole conversation. He nodded at her just once, and she nodded back. An understanding passed between them, silent but solid. They were in this together, for better or worse. As Christmas approached, Mara started talking about traditions. "We should do something," she said one morning while they were washing dishes. "Make it special for them." Elias dried a plate with more force than necessary. "Don't have much to work with up here. Doesn't need to be elaborate, just something to mark the day. Show them it matters." "You got ideas?" "A few." Mara scrubbed at a pot, her movements brisk and efficient. "We could make a proper feast. Nothing fancy, just better than what we eat every day. Maybe carve some decorations from wood. Caleb seems to like working with his hands." Elias thought about it. Christmas had never been something he celebrated much, not since he'd moved to the mountains. It was just another day, another stretch of cold to survive. But looking at the children now, Caleb helping Lila with her boots, both of them bundled in clothes still too big for their thin frames, he realized Mara was right. They needed something to look forward to, something that said life could be more than just survival. "All right," he said. "We'll do it." Mara smiled, quick and genuine. "Good. Then you're in charge of the tree." "Tree?" "Small one. Something we can put in the corner. I'll handle the rest." Before he could argue, she'd already moved on to the next task, her mind clearly running through lists and plans. Elias shook his head, wondering what he'd just agreed to, but he couldn't deny the small flicker of anticipation building in his chest. 2 days before Christmas, Elias took Caleb out to find a tree. The snow was deep and the going was slow, but the boy didn't complain. He trudged along behind Elias, his breath coming out in white puffs, his eyes scanning the forest with the same careful attention Elias had been teaching him. "What kind of tree are we looking for?" Caleb asked. "Pine. Small enough to fit through the door, straight, if we can find it." They walked for an hour, searching, before Caleb spotted one that might work. A young pine about 4 feet tall, growing at the edge of a clearing. Elias inspected it, checking for disease or damage, then nodded. "This'll do. Stand back." He chopped it down with quick, efficient strokes, then hoisted it over his shoulder. On the way back, Caleb was unusually quiet, his expression thoughtful. "Something on your mind?" Elias asked. The boy hesitated. "You think Mrs. Rowan's happy here?" The question surprised him. Why wouldn't she be? She gave up a lot. Her house in town, her business, all her friends. Just to come up here with us. Elias stopped walking and turned to face the boy. "You worried about that?" "I don't want her to leave." "She's not going to leave." "How do you know?" It was the same question Caleb had asked a dozen times in different ways, and Elias understood the root of it. The boy had lost too much to trust in permanence, but this time Elias had an answer that felt true. Because when Mara makes a promise, she keeps it. She said she'd stay, and she will. That's just who she is. Caleb studied his face, searching for doubt, and seemed to find none. "Okay?" They walked the rest of the way in silence, but the tension in the boy's shoulders had eased. When they got back to the cabin, Mara had transformed the interior. She'd cleaned everything until it shined, hung bundles of dried herbs from the rafters for decoration, and somehow managed to make the small, rough space feel almost festive. Lila was sitting at the table, carefully cutting shapes from scraps of cloth under Mara's instruction. Got the tree, Elias announced, setting it down in the corner Mara had cleared. She inspected it with a critical eye, then nodded. Perfect. Caleb, you want to help me anchor it? The boy rushed over, eager to help, and together they rigged a stand from pieces of scrap wood. Once it was stable, Mara brought out the cloth shapes Lila had been cutting, stars and birds and simple geometric patterns, and showed the children how to tie them to the branches. Elias stood back, watching them work. The tree was lopsided and the decorations were crude, but there was something undeniably cheerful about it. Something that made the cabin feel less like a shelter and more like a home. That night, Mara cooked the best meal Elias had tasted in years. She'd been saving ingredients for weeks without telling him, dried venison, carrots, and potatoes from her own stores, flour she'd been rationing carefully. She made a stew thick enough to stand a spoon in, fresh biscuits with butter, and even a small pudding sweetened with molasses and dried apples. They ate until they were uncomfortably full, and then they sat around the fire while Mara told stories, old frontier tales she'd heard from her grandmother, funny anecdotes from her years running the boarding house, anything to keep the children entertained and distracted from the cold outside. Lila laughed. Actually laughed. A small, bright sound that shocked all of them into silence. Mara recovered first. What's so funny, sweetheart? Lila pointed at Elias. His face. Elias blinked. My face? When you ate the pudding, you looked surprised. He probably had. The pudding had been shockingly good. Caleb started laughing too, and then Mara joined in, and before long all four of them were laughing together in the warm firelight, the sound filling the cabin and pushing back the winter darkness. For the first time since this whole thing started, Elias felt something uncomplicated and pure. Happiness. Not relief, not satisfaction, not the grim determination to keep going. Just simple, straightforward happiness. It didn't last. 2 days after Christmas, Fletcher showed up at the cabin unannounced. Elias saw him coming from a distance and felt his stomach drop. Official visits were never good news, and Fletcher's expression was too serious for this to be social. Fletcher, Elias said when the man dismounted, what brings you up here? Need to talk to you and Mrs. Rowan. Official business. Inside, Mara had already put the children in the far corner with quiet instructions to stay there. She stood beside Elias, her face composed but her hands clenched at her sides. Fletcher removed his hat and held it awkwardly. Judge Harlow sent me. There's been a complaint. What kind of complaint? Mara asked sharply. Someone in town filed a petition saying the children aren't being properly cared for. Said the living conditions up here are unsuitable for minors, especially in winter. Elias felt anger flare hot in his chest. Who filed it? Can't say. It's anonymous, but the judge has to take it seriously. He's sending an inspector up next week to evaluate the situation. An inspector? Mara's voice was flat, dangerous. To evaluate whether we're fit to care for children we've been successfully caring for months. I know it's not fair, Mrs. Rowan, but it's procedure. If you want to keep custody, you have to cooperate. Elias wanted to throw Fletcher out, wanted to tell him and the judge and whoever filed that damn petition to go to hell. But he knew that would only make things worse. What do we need to do? He asked through clenched teeth. Make sure the cabin's clean. Make sure the children look healthy and well fed. Answer the inspector's questions honestly. That's all you can do. Fletcher put his hat back on and headed for the door. Before he left, he turned back. For what it's worth, I told the judge I think you're doing fine, but my opinion doesn't count for much. After he left, the cabin fell into tense silence. Caleb and Lila watched them with wide, frightened eyes. Are they going to take us away? Caleb asked, his voice small. No, Elias said firmly. They're not. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. The next week passed in a blur of anxious preparation. Mara cleaned the cabin obsessively, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed. Elias patched the last few gaps in the walls and reinforced the doorframe. They made sure the children had clean clothes, full bellies, and looked as healthy as possible. But underneath it all was the constant, gnawing fear that it wouldn't be enough. That some bureaucrat from town would take one look at their rough mountain life and decide it wasn't suitable for children, no matter how much love and care went into it. The inspector arrived on a gray, bitter morning. She was a thin woman in her 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. Her name was Mrs. Pritchard, and she carried a leather folder full of papers and a pen she clicked constantly while walking through the cabin. She asked questions about their routine, their food supplies, the children's education. Mara answered calmly, detailing everything they'd been doing to care for Caleb and Lila. Elias stood to the side, forcing himself to stay quiet, knowing his temper wouldn't help. Mrs. Pritchard inspected the cabin with a critical eye, noting the patched roof, the small space, the single bed. She interviewed the children separately, asking them if they felt safe, if they were being fed, if anyone had hurt them. Caleb answered every question with quiet confidence. Lila, to everyone's shock, spoke up clearly when asked if she wanted to stay. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than Elias had ever heard it. "I want to stay here." Mrs. Pritchard made notes, her expression unreadable. After 2 hours, she closed her folder and stood. "I'll submit my report to Judge Harlow within the week. You'll be notified of his decision." "And?" Mara pressed. "What's your recommendation going to be?" Mrs. Pritchard looked at her for a long moment. "That's not something I'm at liberty to discuss." She left without another word, and the cabin fell into suffocating silence. That night, nobody slept well. Caleb tossed and turned, mumbling in his sleep. Lila clung to Mara, her small fingers gripping the fabric of Mara's nightgown. And Elias lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining all the ways this could go wrong. 3 days later, Fletcher returned. This time, he was smiling. "Judge Harlow reviewed the report," he said, not bothering with preamble. "Mrs. Pritchard recommended that custody remain with you. The judge agreed. It's official. Caleb and Lila are yours, permanently." The relief was so overwhelming, Elias had to sit down. Mara made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pulled both children into a fierce embrace. "You're sure?" she asked Fletcher, her voice shaking. "It's final? It's final. Congratulations." After Fletcher left, they stood there in the cabin, 4 people who'd been strangers just months ago, and let the reality sink in. They were a family now. Not by blood, not by accident, but by choice. And that meant everything. The permanence of it didn't sink in all at once. It came in waves, over days and weeks, settling into their bones the way warmth finally reaches you after hours in the cold. That first night after Fletcher left with the news, they celebrated quietly. Mara made cornbread with extra honey, and Elias told the children they could stay up past their usual bedtime. It wasn't much of a party, but it didn't need to be. What mattered was the 4 of them sitting around the fire. The weight of uncertainty finally lifted. Caleb kept looking at Elias and Mara like he expected someone to burst through the door and tell them it was all a mistake. Lila stayed close to Mara's side, her small hand gripping the fabric of Mara's skirt. "You understand what this means?" Elias asked them both. "You're not temporary anymore. You're staying permanently." Caleb's throat worked, his eyes suddenly wet. "So nobody can take us away? Ever?" "Not unless you want to leave," Mara said gently. "And even then, we'd probably argue with you." The boy tried to smile, but it turned into something else. A release of months of fear and uncertainty. He buried his face in his hands and cried, his shoulders shaking. Lila immediately moved to him, wrapping her thin arms around her brother, and Mara joined them, pulling both children close. Elias sat across from them, feeling like an outsider looking in on something intimate and fragile. But then Caleb looked up, his face streaked with tears, and reached out a hand toward him. "You too," the boy said, his voice breaking. Elias hesitated for only a second before moving to them, awkward and uncertain but present. Mara's hand found his shoulder, squeezing once, and for the first time in his adult life, Elias understood what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. They stayed like that until the fire burned low and the children's tears dried, until exhaustion took over and sleep became unavoidable. That night, nobody slept on the floor. They pushed the bed against the wall and all 4 of them piled onto it, and the extra blankets spread beside it, tangled together in a way that was uncomfortable but felt right. Winter continued its slow march toward spring, but something fundamental had changed in the cabin. The tension that had hummed beneath every interaction, the fear that this arrangement might fall apart at any moment, was gone. What replaced it was something steadier, more solid, a foundation. Mara started talking about improvements they could make when the weather warmed. A bigger garden, maybe an addition to the cabin, something that would give the children their own space. Elias listened to her plans and found himself adding to them, suggesting a better location for the chicken coop he'd been meaning to build, talking about expanding the lean-to for the animals. They were planning a future now, together. One afternoon in late January, Elias was teaching Caleb how to set snares along the tree line when the boy asked a question that caught him off guard. "You ever think about having kids? Before us, I mean." Elias adjusted the wire carefully, making sure the loop was the right size. "Not really. Never seemed like something that would work with the way I lived. But you're good at it, taking care of us." "I'm learning. That's different than being good at it." Caleb watched him work for a moment, then said quietly, "My pa used to say that being good at something just meant you didn't quit when it got hard." Elias's hands stilled. "Your pa was a smart man." "Yeah." The boy's voice was soft, sad. "He was." They finished setting the snares in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Grief didn't disappear just because you found something new to hold on to. Elias was learning that. It lived alongside the good things, a constant companion that sometimes hurt and sometimes just ached, but was always there. On the way back to the cabin, Caleb spoke again. "I still miss them, my parents. But I'm glad we're here. Is that okay? To feel both things at once?" Elias stopped walking and turned to face the boy. "It's more than okay. It's human. You don't have to choose between remembering them and being happy now. You can do both." Caleb nodded, looking relieved, like he'd been carrying that question around for weeks and finally had permission to let it go. When they got back, they found Mara and Lila in the middle of a baking project that had clearly gone off the rails. Flour covered every surface, including both of them, and the kitchen smelled like something had burned. "Don't ask," Mara said when she saw Elias's expression. "Wasn't planning to." Lila giggled, an actual giggle, and held up her flour-covered hands like she was proud of the mess. Mara tried to look stern but couldn't quite manage it, and soon all four of them were laughing at the disaster. They ate the burned biscuits anyway because wasting food wasn't an option, and Elias declared them not bad if you don't think about it too hard, which earned him a swat from Mara and more giggles from Lila. These were the moments that mattered, Elias realized. Not the grand gestures or the dramatic declarations, but the small, ordinary chaos of people learning to live together. The fights over chores and the shared meals and the laughter that came from nowhere and meant everything. As February arrived, Lila started talking in full sentences. It happened gradually, a word or two at a time, building into something more complete. Her voice was quiet, almost whispery, but it was there. One morning, while Mara was braiding her hair, Lila said something that made everyone stop. "I like it here." Mara's hands paused mid-braid. "You do?" "It's safe." Lila's reflection in the small mirror met Mara's eyes. "And you don't leave." The simple statement carried so much weight it was almost unbearable. Mara blinked rapidly, fighting tears, and finished the braid with gentle fingers. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart. None of us are." Lila nodded, accepting this as fact, and the conversation moved on. But Elias, watching from across the room, saw the way Mara's hands trembled slightly as she tied off the braid, saw the fierce protectiveness in her expression, and understood that whatever this family had become, it was permanent in ways that went deeper than any legal document. The next challenge came from an unexpected direction. Caleb had been doing well, eating regularly, sleeping better, even putting on some much-needed weight. But one morning in early March, Elias found him outside the cabin before dawn, sitting in the snow with his knees pulled to his chest, staring at nothing. "You're going to freeze out here," Elias said, sitting down beside him. "Couldn't sleep." "Nightmares?" Caleb shook his head. "Just thinking." Elias waited, letting the silence stretch. He'd learned that sometimes the best thing you could do was just be present and let the other person decide if they wanted to talk. Finally, Caleb said, "What if I forget them? My parents? What if I can't remember what my ma's voice sounded like, or the way my pa laughed?" Elias had been afraid of this. The question beneath the question, the guilt that came with moving forward. "You won't forget," he said carefully. "Not the important things." "How do you know?" "Because they're part of you. The way you take care of your sister, that's them. The way you're learning to be kind and strong at the same time, that's them too. They're in everything good about you, and that doesn't go away just because they're not here." Caleb was quiet for a long time, processing this. Do you think they'd like you and Mrs. Rowan? I hope so. I think they would. The boy's voice was stronger now, more certain. I think they'd be happy we found you. Something in Elias's chest cracked open at those words. He put his arm around Caleb's shoulders and pulled him close, and they sat there together in the pre-dawn cold, watching the sky lighten over the mountains. When they finally went inside, Mar had breakfast ready and Lila was setting the table, and it struck Elias how normal this had all become, how quickly the impossible had transformed into the everyday. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it came with purpose. The snow began to melt in earnest, revealing dead grass and muddy earth and the promise of growth underneath. The days grew longer, the sun warmer, and the world started to wake up. Mara threw herself into planning the garden with an enthusiasm that was both infectious and slightly intimidating. She drew diagrams, made lists, consulted with Elias about which areas got the most sun. Caleb helped her measure out the plot, and even Lila got involved, choosing which vegetables they should plant based entirely on which ones she thought sounded prettiest. Carrots, she declared seriously, and peas, and those ones that look like little trees. Broccoli, Mara suggested. Lila nodded. Those. They planted in late April when the risk of frost had mostly passed. All four of them worked together, digging rows, dropping seeds, covering them with soil. Elias's back ached by the end of the day, and his hands were covered in dirt, but there was something deeply satisfying about it. They were building something that would feed them, sustain them, carry them through the next winter. That night, Mara sat beside him on the porch while the children played in the cabin. The air was finally warm enough to sit outside without shivering, and the sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and pink. You ever think about how we got here? Mara asked quietly. Every day. You have any regrets? Elias thought about it honestly. The last 6 months had been harder than anything he'd done in years. Harder than surviving alone in the mountains, harder than the war, harder than any physical challenge he'd faced. Learning to live with other people, to compromise and communicate and care about someone else's needs above your own. That took a different kind of strength. No, he said finally. You? Not a single one. Mara leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture so natural and comfortable it took his breath away. I know we didn't start this the normal way, but I think we ended up exactly where we were supposed to be. Elias didn't believe in fate or destiny or any grand plan. He believed in choices and consequences and the random chaos of the universe. But sitting there with Mara, listening to the children's laughter drift through the open door, he had to admit that sometimes chaos worked out better than any plan ever could. You know I love you, right? The words came out before he could stop them, rough and awkward, but true. Mara lifted her head to look at him, surprise and something softer flickering across her face. You never said that before. Should have said it sooner. No, this is the right time. She smiled, and it transformed her entire face. I love you too. Have for a while now. They sat there in this fading light, hands linked, and Elias felt something settle in his chest that had been restless his entire life. This was what he'd been looking for without knowing it. Not solitude, not independence, but connection, belonging, home. The summer brought its own challenges and triumphs. The garden grew faster than any of them expected, and they spent long days weeding and watering and fighting off rabbits that thought they had a right to the vegetables. Caleb took on more responsibilities without being asked, checking the trap lines and helping Elias with repairs around the property. Lila followed Mara everywhere, learning to cook and sew and all the small domestic skills that made life on the frontier possible. One afternoon in July, Elias was fixing a broken section of fence when Caleb approached him with an unusually serious expression. Can I ask you something? The boy said. Always. Would it be okay if... He hesitated, suddenly uncertain. Would it be okay if I started calling you Pa? And Mrs. Rowan Ma? Elias set down his hammer, his throat suddenly tight. He'd wondered if this would come up, but he'd never wanted to push it. The children had parents, and nothing would change that. But they also had him and Mara now, and the labels mattered less than the relationship underneath. That's up to you, Elias said carefully. We'll be proud either way. But if it feels right to you, then yes, it's more than okay. Caleb nodded, looking relieved. I talked to Lila about it. She wants to do it too. Then that's settled. That night at dinner, Lila turned to Mara and said very clearly, "Ma, can I have more carrots?" Mara's fork clattered against her plate. Her eyes filled with tears, and she had to swallow twice before she could speak. "Of course, sweetheart. As many as you want." Across the table, Caleb caught Elias's eye and smiled, a real, genuine smile that showed he was finally starting to heal. They were a family, not by blood, not by accident, but by the daily choice to show up for each other. And that made it real in ways that went deeper than any other bond Elias had ever known. As summer faded into autumn, they prepared for the next winter with the experience of having survived the last one. The woodpile grew higher, the root cellar filled with vegetables from the garden. Mara canned everything she could, lining the shelves with jars of preserves and pickled vegetables that would carry them through the cold months. Elias built the addition to the cabin he and Mara had talked about, a small room with 2 narrow beds where Caleb and Lila could sleep. It wasn't fancy, but it gave them privacy and space of their own, and the pride in Caleb's face when he saw it finished was worth every hour of work. On a cool October evening, almost exactly a year after Elias had found the wagon on the mountain trail, they all sat on the porch watching the sunset. The aspens were turning gold again, and the air carried that particular sharpness that promised winter was coming. Lila sat in Mara's lap, drowsy and content. Caleb was beside Elias, whittling a piece of wood into something that might eventually be a bird. The silence was comfortable, easy, the kind that came from people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. "You know what I was thinking?" Caleb said suddenly. "What's that?" Elias asked. "I was thinking that if my parents could see us now, they'd be happy. They'd know we're okay." Mara's arms tightened around Lila. "I think you're right. I think they'd like you both," Caleb continued. "I think they'd be grateful we found people who actually wanted us." Elias felt the familiar ache in his chest, the one that came from loving people so much it hurt. "We more than wanted you. We needed you, you know that?" Caleb looked up at him, confused. "How?" "Because before you two showed up, we were just surviving, getting through days without any real reason to. You gave us a purpose, something to build toward." Elias met Mara's eyes over the children's heads. "You made us a family." It was the truest thing he'd ever said. That night, after the children were asleep in their new room, Elias and Mara stood in the doorway, watching them breathe in the peaceful rhythm of deep sleep. Caleb had one arm thrown over the edge of his bed, and Lila was curled up tight under her blankets, her blonde hair spread across the pillow. "We did good," Mara whispered. "We did." Elias pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Thank you." "For what?" "For saying yes. For staying. For loving them the way you do." Mara turned in his arms, her eyes serious. "You gave me a second chance at something I thought I'd lost forever. I should be thanking you." "Then we're even." She smiled and kissed him, soft and sweet, and they stood there in the doorway, 2 people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something real from the wreckage. The winter that followed was hard, because winters in the Wyoming mountains were always hard. But it was different from the one before. They knew what to expect now. They had routines and systems and enough supplies to last. More importantly, they had each other. When the storms came, they weathered them together. When the cabin grew cold, they huddled close and told stories until the fire caught again. When food ran low, they rationed carefully and made do with what they had. Caleb grew taller, his shoulders broadening as he took on more of the heavy work. Lila's vocabulary expanded daily, her voice growing stronger and more confident. She sang sometimes now, old songs she remembered from before, and the sound of it filled the cabin with something beautiful. Mara and Elias learned to fight better, quicker resolution, less lingering resentment. They learned each other's limits and boundaries, when to push and when to give space. It wasn't perfect. It was messy and complicated and required constant effort, but it was real, and that made it worth it. On a bright February morning, Fletcher made his annual visit, but this time it wasn't for official business. "Just checking in," he said, accepting the coffee Mara offered. "Making sure you all survived the worst of it." "We're still here," Elias said. Fletcher looked around the cabin, at the neat interior, the well-fed children, the obvious signs of a functioning household, and nodded with satisfaction. "I can see that. Judge Harlow asked me to pass along his regards. Said he's glad he made the right call." After Fletcher left, Mara turned to Elias with a thoughtful expression. You realize we've done it, right? Everything we set out to do. We kept them safe. We made a home. We proved everyone wrong. We did more than that, Elias said, watching Caleb teach Lila how to properly split kindling. We became a family. Spring arrived right on schedule that year, and with it came the ritual of planting the garden again. They expanded it this time, adding rows for tomatoes and beans and squash. Caleb had his own section where he grew pumpkins, determined to have the biggest one in the territory by autumn. Lila planted flowers along the edge, bright spots of color that served no practical purpose but made everyone smile. One evening in late May, Mara made an announcement over dinner. I've been thinking, she said. We should make this official. Elias frowned. Make what official? Their names. Right now they're still Caleb and Lila Harper, but if they want, we could legally change them to Rowan. She looked at the children, giving them the choice. You don't have to. Harper was your parents' name, and it's a good name, but if you want to share ours, we'd be honored. Caleb and Lila exchanged a long look, that silent communication that only siblings shared. Finally, Caleb spoke. Can we keep Harper too? Like a middle name? Of course, Mara said. Then, yeah, we want to be Rowans. The paperwork took months to process, but by the time autumn arrived again, it was official. Caleb Harper, Rowan, and Lila Harper Rowan. The names looked right on paper, but they felt even better spoken aloud. 2 years after that first desperate trip down to Prospect, after the rushed wedding and the uncertain beginning, Elias stood on his porch and looked at everything they'd built. The cabin had expanded to include the addition and a covered porch. The garden stretched across a quarter-acre, producing enough food to get them through winters with some to spare. The animals were healthy, the trap lines productive. But more than the physical improvements, he saw the change in the people. Caleb was almost 14 now, tall and confident, helping with the heavy work without complaint. Lila was 10, bright and curious, her silence a distant memory. Mara had settled into mountain life like she'd been born to it, her toughness tempered with warmth. And Elias himself had changed too. The hard, isolated man who'd avoided human connection for years was gone, replaced by someone who knew how to love, how to compromise, how to be part of something bigger than himself. That night, gathered around the dinner table, Lila asked a question that made them all pause. Do you think we'll always be together? Like this? Mara reached across the table and took her hand. Nothing's guaranteed in this life, sweetheart. But we'll do everything we can to make sure yes. That's a promise. What if something happens? Lila pressed, needing reassurance. What if... Then we handle it, Elias interrupted gently. Together. That's what families do. They face whatever comes, and they don't do it alone. Caleb nodded. He's right. We're stuck with each other now. Stuck? Mara raised an eyebrow. That's the word you choose? Caleb grinned. Lucky. We're lucky to have each other. Better. They finished dinner in comfortable conversation, the kind that meandered through topics without purpose or destination. After the dishes were cleaned and the children had gone to their room, Elias and Mara sat by the fire one last time. You ever wonder what would have happened if you'd said no that day? Elias asked. In the saloon? Every day for the first month, Mara admitted, but not anymore. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be. Even with all the fights and the struggle and the hard winters, especially because of those things. Easy doesn't build character. Easy doesn't show you what you're made of. She leaned against him, fitting into his side like she'd always belonged there. We earned this, Elias, every bit of it. She was right. They'd taken an impossible situation and made it work through sheer determination and daily acts of kindness. They'd learned that love wasn't just a feeling, it was a choice you made over and over, especially when things got hard. The frontier didn't reward grand gestures or perfect intentions. It rewarded consistency, showing up, doing the work even when you were tired or frustrated or scared, being kind when the world gave you no reason to be. And in the end, that's what had saved them all. Not strength or independence or stubborn pride, just simple, relentless kindness. The choice to care for people who needed caring for. The choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. The choice to build something real in a place that offered no guarantees. Years later, when people in Prospect asked Elias how he'd ended up with a family after all those years alone, he never gave them the full story. He just said he'd found some children who needed help, and a woman brave enough to help him provide it. The rest, he figured, was their business. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when the work was done and the cabin was warm, he'd think about that wagon on the mountain trail, about the choice he'd made to stop instead of riding past, about Mara standing up in a saloon full of skeptics and asking him one simple question. Will you be kind to them? He'd been trying ever since. Some days he succeeded, some days he failed, but he never stopped trying. And in the end, that was all any of them could do. Show up, do their best, and choose kindness even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. Because that's what family meant, not perfection, not ease. Just the stubborn, beautiful decision to love people and stick with them, no matter what the mountains threw your way. And on this mountain, in this small cabin that had somehow become a home, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.